What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Mindful Muscle Podcast. Paul Klingen, your host here, and we got Jake on for what is going to be the first of hopefully many episodes. If we learn anything from this book review, many episodes, we're going to do a book review every Tuesday and basically look at all the different books that we've read that have been helpful in the development of us as humans, as coaches, as people in fitness, and take a lot of those lessons and in an abbreviated way and give them to you. So you'll hear quotes, takeaways, things that really stood out to us and had an impact on us. And then you can listen to these and be like, oh my gosh, the same thing happened to me when I read that book. And you might say, oh my gosh, I need to read this book. I've been looking for a good book. So this is going to be a great resource for this. Jake is super well read. I try and read. And so when we compared our notes on books that we read, this one, Ego's the Enemy by Ryan Holiday, was one of the first ones where we're like, yeah, that's a no-brainer. Let's do that.
A lot of overlap. And this has definitely been one of both of our favorites. So I'm excited to jump in.
Yeah. So we're going to just jump right into it. But first, let's go by the numbers. So author Ryan Holiday, I completed it last August, around August 4th is what the Audible said. Listen time is 6:56 if you're listening to it. Pages 256. It was released June 14th, 2016. I gave it a readability, even though I listened to it, of 8 out of 10. And I'll tell why a little bit later. But then rating 9 out of 10. I didn't want to come right out of the gate and be like, it's a 10 out of 10. It's amazing, because I want to reserve some of that. And I also do think that I would almost think of ratings for like a story-based book versus a whether it's entertainment or educational based book is like different, right? Fiction, nonfiction, sci-fi. Like if I'm reading a Star Wars book, I'm like, oh, it's a 10 out of 10. It's out of this world. But obviously, this is a little bit different. So 9 out of 10. What did you put for readability and rating?
For readability, honestly, Ryan Holiday is always one of the reasons I like him is I can just read his books and it's very non-draining. It's very easy and flows very well. So 9.5 out of 10 for readability. For me, 8 out of 10 for an overall rating, just because I feel like he kind of speaks to a specific person where I resonate with all the things he talks about in his books, but I sometimes feel like I struggle less with like these outward action oriented things. Whereas he definitely mentions a lot of things about like being in your head and being very thoughtful, but I don't know. I think that part of it is just I've resonated different with it. Like I did read it for the first time a couple years ago, and I felt like I got more out of it then. But it's just been one of those books where I think it more so than other books really has like a time when you need it. So kind of like, for example, how he goes into the 3 different parts of ego, I guess is how he phrases it, where you're aspiring, you're succeeding, or you're failing. And I think that specifically this would be one of those books where like my note to myself would be, pull this out at a specific time where you reach like this hiccup where he talks about in the book, and even being able to go in and be like, oh yeah, I remember this specific section. I want to think about this lesson again. So I think it's very much something that can just be totally different at different times.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, just because part of why I put a readability 8 out of 10 was I would have, and he does this for his other books, where he tells these like little mini self-contained stories where it's almost like each chapter is an example for you to raise your hand and be like, oh, that's me. And so that's super nice because you can get like something really quick out of it as it applies to a certain stage in your life at different times. I just wish there were a little bit more storied elements to it. And I know what he's saying is true, but it's almost like if I had the entire history of mankind, like I could find 20 chapters worth of stories of someone doing something. So he's just like, oh, what's a good example of someone having no ego? I'll go back to like, 200 years ago, grab this one person and tell, and it's like very matter of factly, where it's like, Jenny jumped over the log. Jenny didn't have an ego. Jenny was smart, as opposed to being a little bit more colorful, which again, you mentioned this, he's not writing, I guess he's writing to a specific type of person. And I almost get the sense that he's writing to like, a partner or a marketing director or someone in almost like a very corporate sense. And that's kind of his background too with American Apparel and what he experienced there. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because like in my head, the way I want to contextualize it and rationalize it is like, oh, I'm not a person with a very big ego, but like understanding that part of what he talks about in the book is the more that you say that, the more it's likely that you're driven by ego. And so I'm not naive. I know that I'm definitely driven by that, but I guess largely, and again, it's where it's changed from the last time I read it a couple of years ago. I've spent a lot of time on mindfulness and meditation, and those have become big aspects of my life. So I feel like this is something I've got a lot better grip on. And I think that the readability and the rating of the book is so interesting in the context of noting when you first read it, because I guess going back to the readability, at a different time in my life, it could have been a lot harder to read just because I was really having to like marinate on some of these lessons. And again, when you read a lot of nonfiction, you start to go, okay, I'm familiar with these concepts, and you can kind of breeze through them more easily. But if this is your first time picking up a nonfiction book, it's going to be one of those things where maybe a lot of these things are brand new and kind of overwhelming at first. So I just think it's interesting to contextualize how a book can mean so many different things at different points in your life. And that's why it's fun to revisit books, I think.
Yeah, you brought up a good point. It's almost like we need a perceptivity score, where it's like, how perceptive are you to absorb this book? Because someone with a massive ego that's like, that's not me, they'd be like, this book is a 1 out of 10. I hate it, can't stand it. Whereas someone who's like, oh, I'm the worst, and maybe they're like on the other end of the spectrum, they're going to be like, everything's about me, and then get overwhelmed and think that they're a terrible person. I think part of the reason why I liked it so much is because when I read it, I was feeling really stuck, and it shined a light on a lot of reasons why I was stuck. And so it was super helpful at that time.
Yeah. And I think going back to, like, you kind of touched on a little bit of the criticism of the book, my one criticism would kind of be similar, where it's, I think I would have gotten more out of the book if he would have talked more about, like, I remember in one of the first few chapters, he's like, do people still succeed with massive egos? Of course they do. Look at Steve Jobs, look at Kanye West. And I kind of wish he would have played devil's advocate more and been like, this is how, sometimes you play with a big ego your whole life, and you really hit it big. But he is just constantly on this is where you fail. This is where you fail when ego gains control. This is where you succeed when you let it go. Because in reality, that's one of the things that I love reading in nonfiction, is those gray areas where it's like, yes, this person technically was living in a way that was not virtuous, but sometimes the cards just fall in your favor anyway. So I think kind of going into more of that would have made it more well-rounded for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting, especially when you put it through that lens of like Kanye, right, or Steve Jobs. And I think another book that we'll review in the future is 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. And it is very much that. It's like, if you're following these laws of power, you might have a massive ego, but you're going to get these things. And I think I remember listening to that too, like waiting for that devil's advocate side of it, because there's times when like the ego is necessary. And it
for sure,
like,
yeah.
It's what has you shave your face, you know what I mean, or has you get a haircut because you care, and it's important to care. I think that's a really interesting segue. So what we'll do on these reviews is we'll just go overall kind of thoughts and summaries, a lot of kind of just like initial by the numbers, and maybe criticism, but then we'll go best quotes and then any other takeaways and highlights. So the first quote I put down is tied to what you were saying. People can get lucky and win. People can be assholes and win. Anyone can win, but not everyone is the best possible version of themselves, which stood out to me, one, for the reason you mentioned, where it's like people can be a Steve Jobs or Kanye West, but not everyone is the best possible version of themselves. And I think that's another interesting thing too, where it's like, I think a lot of people strive to be the best version of themselves, but some people also like don't care to be the best version of themselves. They just want to be the best of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and I think that one of the first things that I noted down that I probably spent the most time ruminating on was just the difference between confidence and, I don't think he uses the word cockiness, but I guess just like going back to ego. So the first highlight I made, this is in the first 10, 20 pages or so, is he said, one must ask, if your belief in yourself is not dependent on actual achievement, what is it dependent on? The answer, too often when we are just setting out, is nothing. It's ego. This is why we often see precipitous rises followed by falls. And I think that that's such a fascinating thing, because again, it just reminds me of, I think the point I was stuck on from earlier was, you would almost get the message that having no ego is what you should strive for. But I would always argue that you need a little bit of ego, and you need a little bit of naivety, I think, almost to achieve great things. And so I think that that's something that gets lost is, yes, it's important to build confidence based on experiences, but I think that some of that really grandiose thinking that you can go and achieve big goals is a prerequisite to, going and doing the hard work and wanting to do the hard work to get you know going on something, I suppose.
Yeah, it's an interesting segue to the um, other quote I had: "As our island of knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance." So it's
Mhm.
you don't know what you don't know, and it's almost if you knew what was ahead of you in any kind of journey, you would probably be like, "Oh, that's way too hard." But at the same time, it's like that Dunning-Kruger effect where it's like you learn a
Yeah,
ton
that's what I
and
was
then
going to
you
mention.
realize like, "Oh, I actually don't know anything." And so it's just like the bigger your empire is, the more areas you can go and be attacked from. Only in this
Yeah.
area, it's not, the Byzantine Empire, it's your ego.
Yeah, and explain that for people who have maybe never heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, because that's actually what I was just thinking of. I was like, what is the name for that?
Yeah. So it's the concept that you start out and maybe like you're playing the piano and so you learn a few songs and so your perceived skill level goes up super high and you think that you are the best and maybe you're just like this prodigy that picked it up faster than everyone else. And then there's a quick drop off as you learn everything that you realize you don't know. And so it's kind of like this big jump up to where you're super confident, you think you know everything, and then you realize as you learn more how much there is to learn, which is why I love this quote: "As our island of knowledge grows, so does the shore of the ignorance." It's like
Mm-hmm.
as you get more information, you realize how much more information you need to get, and you'll never get it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the other things that I noted was one of the next things that I spent a lot of time thinking about was just the idea of the importance of taking feedback and trying to be objective. That's something I've always struggled with. And I thought a lot about the point he made too, where he says everyone wants to believe that they're special and everyone thinks that they're special. And we all have that, I think, to some extent. And I think the only thing that makes that true is just how hard you want to work to realize it. Like we all have something special and individual to give the world, but it definitely takes a lot of hard work. Like he mentions the 10,000-hour rule. Like you don't just get things handed to you, but you might have a predisposition to go and do something, and working hard on that is what's going to make you successful. I think one of the things that he alludes to is it's important to know what you're good at and be aware of your skill set, because that is going to be the biggest prerequisite to being successful in a way. Like, for example, I think a good thing I've heard a lot is like, yeah, if you're 5'5", you're not going to be well versed to like go and put a bunch of effort into trying to be the next NBA, star, just because you start from behind. If you don't enjoy writing and you want to build a business or you want to build an online presence, maybe you shouldn't start a blog, maybe you should start like a YouTube. And so I think part of what he really tries to harp on is think more seriously about what you're putting your effort towards, and that is kind of the first step before just working hard for the sake of working hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
about the quote on feedback that I highlighted was, the art of taking feedback is such a crucial skill in life, particularly harsh and critical feedback. We not only need to take this harsh feedback, but actively solicit it, labor to seek out the negative precisely when our friends and family and brain are telling us that we're doing great. And I thought about, again, about like my experience in stand-up comedy. Like if any of my best friends or my mom or dad or my brother are ever telling me they love what I'm doing, they think it's hilarious, they think it's really good, I appreciate that. But it's like I understand that they're never going to be the most objective people that are going to give me the most objective feedback. So just trying to keep in mind that you have to try to seek out ways to improve and get an objective view of how you're doing, which to me is one of the hardest things.
Yeah. It's yesterday I was talking to this about someone where it's almost the reverse where so if people you have trust equity in are people that you would trust more of what they say because they've built that equity with you, right? It's like if a bear says, or not a bear, let's just say me, like I'm not good with cars and I'm like, hey, you need to change your oil. You're like, maybe I do. But if Jeff Gordon or Dale Earnhardt's like, hey man, you need to change your oil, you're like, oh,
Mm,
I need to change my oil. This guy knows what I'm talking about. But it's almost like the reverse with that, to where someone you have a ton of trust equity, if they go and now try to cash into you and be like, oh yeah, you're so smart, honey, like keep doing it. You're like, no, I'm not. Don't tell me that.
Mm-hmm.
I want a stranger to tell me that who I don't trust, because then I know at least it's objective.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of tied to that quote and that angle is another one that I had. Those who have subdued their ego understand that it doesn't degrade you when others treat you poorly, it degrades them, which I think is a huge place to come around mentally. And I try to grab quotes too for people, just because a lot of listeners are working on things from a health and fitness standpoint. Is like there can be so much negativity, right, around what you're doing from a health and fitness standpoint. Just recognize that anytime someone's saying something, it's their own ego lashing out at you, and it's your job to subdue your ego to not like accept that lash out, because it
Mm-hmm.
really is just them expressing. It's just like it's their ego becoming tangible, even though it's not, because it's words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's so difficult. Like realizing, one of the quotes that I often come back to is that hurt people,
Mm-hmm.
and realizing that it reminds me of the Four Agreements, which I'm sure is a book that we'll do at some point. It's always been one of, I know it's a favorite for both of us, but just not taking on other people's shit, which is hard. But that's when someone is going to talk bad about you, or degrade you in some way, or demean you. That is a product of their hurt in some way. It's not an objective look at what you're doing or how you're doing. Now, that's where the difference lies too, where you do want to get objective feedback. And so, kind of like you said, having that come from someone that you trust and that you believe is telling you like it is the most important thing to improve. And then not only hearing that and resonating in the things that you're not good at and wish you were doing better at, but then developing a plan to improve and seeking constant improvement, and not just getting overwhelmed with how big of a journey it is to get successful at whatever you want to be successful at. So, for example, again, through the health and fitness lens, if you find out that you really need to work on your habit of snacking and your habit of, getting home from work and not wanting to go to the gym, I guess it just speaks to like habit formulation. And are you going to get hung up on, I'm the person who can't commit and I'm mad at myself, or I'm going to try to take small steps every day to change my habits and change the type of decisions I make?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because especially in the health and fitness realm, people get so frustrated with their situation that they try and destroy it. And this is another quote: attempting to destroy something out of hate or ego often ensures that it will be preserved and disseminated forever. And so, like, if you're like, oh, I'm so mad at myself, like I'm a snacker, I hate it, or I'm
Mm-hmm.
so upset that like I haven't lost this weight, you're coming at it with this like hate or your essentially your ego. And that's, you're never going to be able to fully relinquish something if you're coming from that place. And I think of like movies that I watched as a kid, like it would always be this evil villain that was like so upset and he's like, I'm going to destroy this band of rebels or this group of, freedom people. And it's like that kind of hate is just going to make it so that that thing never dies. And it's like you
Mm-hmm.
can't kill it if that's the approach that you're coming at it from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And really trying to not get overwhelmed with identity, whether it's something positive or negative, because you can have that negative identity of, oh, I'm someone who skips workouts, I'm someone who can't stop snacking. Or you can also have that positive identity of someone who's like, oh, yeah, I'm in shape, I know what I'm doing. I think a good example of the latter is fitness changes so much, and the things that we know about fitness and nutrition change so much. For example, like 10, 20 years ago, there was not much knowledge around like the calorie counting and if it fits your macros. It was more so people followed specific diets. And when it came to training, there was so much more of the bro science that people were following on a regular basis. And if you had become attached to certain ways of thinking, oh, I have to eat this way, I have to train this way, you start to close your mind to new perspectives and new opportunities to do things differently. So I think that that's another thing in life that you want to try to stay objective and open-minded to, is if a new, better way comes along, don't be so attached with your identity to one certain way of doing things that you can't adapt and have the ability to change.
Yeah, it really is just like holding on to that story, which you want to believe that is so true. And I think kind of to that point too, or it's like we can believe so hard and fast that like this is the only way to be successful, or this has to be the way to be successful, because we wrap up this like romanticized story and how maybe someone else did it that way or how we're going to do it that way. And sometimes it's not the case.
Mm-hmm. And then one thing I thought a lot about in the success portion, that second portion, where I think Ryan was talking about just how you judge yourself and how you see success, because there's the one chapter where he's talking about basically the allure of trying to earn more status and earn more money. And it's another area where it's very gray, because sometimes if you want to go from making $40,000 a year to $80,000 a year, that might be a good goal, and that might be something you strive for a while, and that's going to improve the quality of your life. But if you just go your entire career being like, I want to make more money, more money, more money, and not thinking about the impact that has in your life, whether it be degrading aspects of your personal life or just being something that has no finite endpoint, that can really take its toll on you too. And to wanting to aspire to higher status and not caring if you've earned it, not caring if you're ready for it. Like, I know he has multiple examples of, it seems like a lot of times he's talking about people that were in war, like generals and stuff like that. Like, he talks about Sherman and Eisenhower, and he keeps alluding to the fact that the most successful people in the military are very good about knowing what they're ready for and not taking on things when they're not ready. And so I think the lesson there is, and that the thing I wrote down here in my book was the What's Your Scorecard lesson by Warren Buffett, where he says, you really have to think about how you're judging things. The scorecard example is basically, so say that you're out to golf. Are you thinking about, do you want to get the best score? Is that the most important thing to you? Are you really just out there to soak up the sun and be outside? Are you out there to socialize with your friends and have fun and have a couple beers? So what's your scorecard applies to so many different things. Like in your career, are you in your 20s? Are you trying to learn as much as you can? Are you trying to maximize the amount of money you can make because you have financial goals? Are you trying to maximize the amount of connections you can make? So really being intentional about, again, kind of like we touched on in the beginning, what you're putting your effort towards. Hard work is, I don't think, super uncommon. I think hard work that is really gaining traction and really working towards something is what's a lot less common in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. The military example is something that I recognize in a couple other chapters. And it's this idea that like you fall in love with this idea of like getting promoted or being the director or being, this hero or celebrity or whatever, that you like end up getting wrapped up in this passion. And this is one of the highlights that I had in one of my favorite chapters. It was just like the idea that we have to spend all our time and energy finding a passion, but that passion ends up costing us because we chase it despite logic or data or what like an objective person to be like, hey, you're not ready for that promotion. You're actually going to cause more harm to your career. You're actually going to cause, more harm to the business. Same thing as like, you're not ready to diet and go into weight loss. You're actually going to cause more harm to your metabolism. You're going to cause more harm to, your body. And we just get so passionate about this thing as opposed to what we should do. And this was, really tied to he talks about purpose, but having a little bit of a difference between like passion is form over function, or what I call sometimes like fashion over function, where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
this looks really good. This promotion will look really good on my resume, over the function. And he's like, purpose is function, 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 function. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you really just focus on, again, like the process, the purpose, and take a step out of this, I idealized, romanticized as to like what it's supposed to be, you're going to end up being happier in the long run.
Mm-hmm. And like even a word that you use there is something I try to think a lot about, is you use the word should. And so when you say should, are you talking about what's your version of success? That's what I think you should strive for. Or a lot of times people say should, and it's based on what people around them think is success or what your parents think is success. Like if you say, oh, should I go to, law school, or should I start my own business? Well, it depends. Like what's going to give you more personal success, what's going to give you more personal fulfillment, versus not just thinking in the context of what's going to impress my friends, what's going to, what are other people in their 20s doing right now, what's going to look cool to like friends or potential partners and stuff like that, but really thinking about what's going to make you fulfilled in the long term. And another thing that Ryan touches on is long-term gratification. All the examples, it seems like, are in the book of people that he sees as successful that have defied ego are people that from an early age had a long-term vision. And even if there was a lot of hiccups and a lot of early failure from an outsider's perspective, they stayed the course and they knew that they were always honoring their values and being humble in learning and developing into the person they wanted to grow into. A lot of times it seems like the people who he gives as examples don't reach success until their late 30s, their 40s, their 50s, because it's such a long-term process of becoming the person that they want to be and iterating on that.
Yeah. I forget where it was in the book, but he talks about basically these people that are really successful at doing what you just said. You don't know who they are.
Mm-hmm.
They aren't out seeking the fame or the fashion or the passion, whatever. They're just head down doing what they're doing, and they're going to continue to do what they're doing. And most people don't see or recognize that. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's almost like a good sign where it's like work in silence. And if you get recognized, great. But that's like, honestly, this is like a total side tangent. I think a lot of people want to be famous or they see like being a celebrity is cool. I think it would suck
Some of
because
the most depressed people for sure.
yeah, you don't get to do what you want to do. Could you imagine like you just went to New York this weekend? It's like, man, you wouldn't be able to. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I want to go to a
Hounded by
movie.
people on the street and
Yeah, and it's like no wonder people have this huge rise, meteoric rise, and precipitous fall. It's like they they are lose touch of everything, partially because of them, but also it's not even their fault. Like media just derails their
yeah.
entire life.
I think the most obvious uh, showing of why that's typically not a good thing is if you look at the amount of or the disproportionate population of celebrities who get into drug use or alcohol use and abuse. It's so much higher than the average population because it's such an unsustainable way to live that they find something intoxicating and it takes the edge off their constant barrage of attention and rise and fall of relevance and I think that's good evidence of how damaging that can be to your psyche.
Yeah, and just like the dopamine hit that no longer does it for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like one cup of coffee does it for you. You do it for 20 years, all of a sudden you need 20 cups of coffee, right? But
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like fame and having everything you want, right? Or the ego getting everything it wants, it's going to be insatiable until it gets to this point to what it asks you to take in is not something that you can physically or mentally handle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, two of my favorite maxims from the book were, and the one I was just kind of touching on was doing over being. So, do you tell people you're a writer, or do you sit down for an hour and write every day? The doing, or do you tell someone that, again, it's an easy example to tie into fitness. Do you tell someone, oh yeah, I'm working out, I'm in shape, or do you put classes or workouts or whatever down in your schedule? Do you get them done? Do you go and do that, without your phone, without posting it to social media? Like, not that that's a bad thing, but being the type of person that is living an active lifestyle and telling people that that's who you are two very different things. And so I'm curious how you think about that. And then the other thing that I was my favorite maxim from the book was just thinking about purpose over passion. So he talks about how intoxicating passion can be. And I think that that's another good example for fitness too. Like you can become passionate about a 30-day workout program or a new diet cleanse or something like that. But purpose is knowing that you're making good long-term decisions with your diet and exercise because that's who you are, because you realize why that's important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the last thing, and this ties into both the things that you just said, that stands out for me the most is just the effort is enough chapter, which I think is towards the end, but it really is to what you're talking about. Rather than posting your workout or being in the middle of your workout, posting a video of your workout, people will see that you were working out because they'll see you a year later and they'll be like, wow, you were obviously working out, right? And there's a balance between not sharing anything and sharing too much. But I think that's the whole name of the game. And this is actually not a quote from the book, but I think it speaks to the whole point of like everything that we create gets judged by others. Doing the right thing was enough. And the quote that I want to talk about is an Andy Warhol one where he says, don't think about making art, just get it done. Let everyone else decide if it's good or bad, whether they love it or hate it, while they're deciding, make even more art, which you can apply to so many different lenses from the idea of just being process oriented. I played baseball in college. If I focus on where the ball's going as opposed to what I need to be doing at the swing mechanic level and how things are feeling, then I'm focusing on the wrong thing. And it's like, while that ball is in flight, I should be hitting another ball as opposed to watching that ball fly. If I have a good meal, rather than going and stepping on the scale right after that, I should be focused on going and having a good meal. And I think that's the hardest thing, is just to remind yourself to stop focusing on the results, and that you're going to look up from being so process oriented, be like, wow, I've climbed 40,000 feet up this mountain. I didn't even realize it, metaphorically or figuratively.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the quotes, I was just going to see if I could find it here, but not from the book, but I think that I initially either saw this in like a Ryan Holiday blog or maybe on his Instagram or something like that. But it was from the Bhagavad Gita, and it goes something like, "You are always entitled to the labor, but never to the fruit." So again, speaking to your point, you can't just put all your value on what's the outcome, because you only have so much power over that, but you will always have power over how much work you put in and the intention of your work. So I think that, again, you can take that too far, because again, what's one of the things we talked about that Ryan writes a lot about in the book is objective feedback. So pairing the labor and intensity of working on something with not getting it attached to the outcome, but also understanding and knowing when to stop the hard work when you're just ramming your head up against a wall, is I think
Yeah.
that the delicate balance that I find that I resonate most with, because I sometimes lean too far in that aspect of, oh, it's all about the work, it's all about the work. But if you don't take a step back every once in a while and seeing, is this work going towards something good, or is it just being kind of turned into wasted energy, is something that's also important.
Yeah. That, I mean,
It's, I mean, again, like, let's like, what another easy thing to tie into fitness. It's like tons of people go, to 5 or 6 Orange Theory classes a week, and that's really hard work, but they'd probably be better suited to work 50% as hard and try to build a base of strength and start doing more weightlifting and focus more on their nutrition.
yeah. This reminds me of a story where I look back, and thank God for my fiance Haley. Shout out to her. But when pandemic happened, like right when we got locked in, I was like, oh, I need to go film a bunch of workout videos. This is how I'm going to make money now. So I was filming these like 20-minute videos that I was uploading and getting like a $15 a month subscription. And I was filming them from like, because I wanted it dark, I wanted the lighting good in the gym. So I'd film it from like 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. And I would do it for like days on end. And she called me. She's like, are you working hard or working smart? And I'm like, I'm just working hard. I don't care what if it's
Mhm.
smart or not. And thank God she called me out, and I had a come to Jesus moment, and that was a bad idea. But you can almost get your identity and your ego wrapped up into like, no one outworks me. Like, I'm the
Mhm.
hardest worker in the room. And sometimes if that's you, like, you're the dumbest person in the room, because there's people doing it way smarter. It's like you can manually build a house, or you can use machines. Like, your choice.
Mhm.
Like, you work smart and hard.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's something I think about, again, like I've kind of mentioned a couple times, how in my life, like I'm 26 now, there's so many people that I'm friends with that are working on like building their career, whatever that means to them. And I think that so often, like I think I touched on this earlier, but hard work is not necessarily uncommon. I think that what's a lot more uncommon is really focusing on what you're working on. And if there was one message, I guess we're kind of getting off the topic of the book here, but if there's one message that I think people can use and really implement into their life, it's work smart, not hard, kind of like you
Yeah.
just said there.
Yeah, it's focus. I think that's another one. It's people, especially with social media and Netflix and all these things, podcasts even. Thanks for listening to the podcast, obviously now at this point, but like focus and attention. And if you could just harness all that focus and attention onto that one thing, you're going to be so much more potent. That's something I heard recently. If you look at potential, potent is kind of like I forget what the word is, but it's like a smaller version of potential. And it's like, if you
Mm-hmm.
want to reach your potential, you need maximum potency. For maximum potency, you need to be as focused as you can possibly be. And the ego wants you to think you can have 10 fires going and still manage them all. You can't.
Mm-hmm.
One fire, build it super big, burn the place down.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Dude, this was fun. We're obviously going to
Yes.
do this every single week. Any other last closing thoughts before we sign off?
I guess just as far as starting these book reviews and being consistent, like if anyone hears this and has a specific idea for a book that they'd like to hear, chances are like Paul and I have read tons of popular nonfiction books. So if there's something you want to hear, make sure you reach out. But yeah, I think just try your best to look at things objectively, try to work hard, but figuring out what you're working on and not just getting the satisfaction of I am this thing. I'm doing instead of being is something you should try to focus on.
Yeah, I think the thing that you said that really stood out to me is the word should. It's almost like
Mm-hmm.
should is, if that word is ever popping up, you should avoid that. Because should means that you are either doing something that you don't actually want to do because someone else is impressing that upon you, or should is stuff that someone is saying to you and they're saying you should, you should, you should. But until you accept that and that's truly what you want for yourself, you'll never actually do it to the degree to which you need to be successful. And so you always need to come to answers yourself. Now, that's not to say that like a coach or a guide or a mentor or a friend can't help you realize that, but I think it's the ego that causes you to not want to realize the truth. And so just like, I don't know, take a time to meditate on that word should,
Yeah.
because that's
Yeah.
that's a
And one,
really interesting word.
yeah. And one more thing about that is another big lesson for me in mindfulness and just trying to be present is I think that in my own life, whenever I'm saying should, I'm being two places at once. So another good example I've talked to clients about before is there is watching your favorite show on Netflix and being present and enjoying that. And then there's like stress watching your favorite show on Netflix where you're watching it and you're kind of enjoying it. But you're like, oh, I should be at the gym. I should be working on this work project. I think whatever you do, you should choose to be doing that. Another good example is like if you're eating like a treat meal, you're having a burger and fries and a beer. Don't be saying I should be having a salad, just be enjoying that and being like, I know that overall my habits are healthy. You know, maybe I live by that 80-20 principle in some way. And so I'm enjoying this. And I'm not saying, oh, I should be doing something else. I'm being bad. It seems like a lot of times when you're saying should, you're making a judgment on yourself, like, oh, I'm being bad. I'm not being the person I want to be. But really just trying to, again, when you use the word intention, be intentional about your choices. And you're not going to have those shoulds where you're trying to be two places at once.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. I mean, great way to end this because it's the Mindful Muscle podcast. I
Mm-hmm.
appreciate you guys all for listening. A
Yeah.
couple
Thank you
last
guys.
housekeeping things. The Mindful Muscle Facebook group is a private Facebook group you can join via the link below the podcast. You got a big community of people that, we have different trainings, demos. We got the Mindful Muscle mini course. We got recipe books, and then you can ask questions, and we go live in that group as well. We'll do Q&As and answer your questions that you've got around training, nutrition, recovery, and mindfulness. And then if you're in the Seattle area, we've got a partnership with the Seattle-based meal prep company, Fuller NutriFuel. You can use Paul 15 for 15% off your first order, then Paul 10 for every order after that. I was cracking myself up because I wrote a funny post yesterday around DoorDash NutriFuel, and then I went on this like random tangent for the caption that, anyway, I thought it was funny. It brought in Lady Galadriel from Lord of the Rings, so definitely check that out and use the discount code because it's cool. Other than that, Jake, thanks for the time. I'll catch you on the next podcast, and thanks for listening to the Mindful Muscle podcast. 5-star rating and review, subscribe, and all that call to action stuff. Do it.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. Later.